That's the upper story. And every chapter of the Bible, well, maybe the overarching theme of the Bible, because probably if you're in so-and-so begat, who was the son of whatever, what's his name, it might not be as apparent there. But as you look at the overarching story of the Bible, what you're going to see is that from Genesis all the way through the return of Jesus and the opening of paradise to the followers of God, God is wanting to bring people back to Himself. And we're going to see a little bit of that today, again, as we see in today's story. But there's this upper story, God's sovereign work. The lower story is the human reaction to that pursuit. So as God is pursuing, our view of what's happening isn't always the same as what God is doing. Would you agree that, okay, that's the satellite that was in orbit this week? And I don't know, maybe some people were concerned about it, but think about that satellite spinning out of, the satellite and people on Earth, kind of how they viewed the satellite coming down, and then think about how God viewed it. Do you think the views were the same? Because God's capacity to see it from the larger view. Or think about even somebody that's on the space station, I think there's still somebody on there, looking at the satellite falling down. Their view from outside is different than our view down here looking up. So from the lower story, the human reaction is our human pursuit, our response, our reaction to God's pursuit, our response to Him. But unfortunately, as you're looking through the story, you're going to see that we don't always see things the way God sees them. And that's true when we go through tragedy in our lives. It's true when we go through trials in our lives. It's true when we experience all of the negative effects that Adam and Eve brought to us of sickness and discord and death. We don't see them the same way that God sees them, nor do we see God's pursuit of us in the same way that He sees it. So there is an us and them aspect of the story, of God's, the upper story, and people, the lower story. And the hope always is that we are going to begin to understand God's story, because one day we're going to be enveloped in that story fully when Jesus redeems all things. So in the story today, in these first few pages that you're going to read of the Scripture that are so nicely put together for us, the story of God's redemption of humanity begins. That's why I love the book of Genesis. We won't spend only just a couple of weeks in it before we move on out of it. But the reason why I love the book of Genesis is because everything that's going to happen to us begins and moves from there. So I want us to look in this upper-lower story for a minute. First of all, in this redemption story as it begins, humanity's cut off from the tree of life. And by us being cut off from the tree of life, we are prevented from the effect of evil lasting forever. That's the upper story. That's really not the lower story. The upper story is God says, among Himself, He says, people have reached out and have seized the determination of good and evil. They are now, have seized the capability, as it were, of determining what good and evil is. We must keep them from reaching out their hand and taking the tree of life and living forever. So I want you to see something about the upper story. God keeping us from the tree of life was not a curse to us. It was a gift. Imagine if evil could never be conquered. If there was no hope of death ever being destroyed. If discord always would have its place. That's what would have occurred if people would have had the capacity to take of the tree of life and live forever. So the upper story is God saying they're not going to take any fruit from that tree again. and that tree is cut off forever. So it's not that tree's not an apple or peach or a plum or a pomegranate, because we haven't seen it either since then. That's the upper story. The lower story is what we felt in the garden. Humans are expelled from the garden. And so, from the human perspective, what do people see? What do you see when you read Genesis? What do I see? People made a mistake, and what does God do? He drop kicks them out of the garden. That's what it seems like in the lower story. People are expelled. And unfortunately, we get what we wanted. What we wanted was the capacity to choose right and wrong. And God allows us, as it were, because He gave us free will, to go that direction, to make the choice. I think you'll have to agree, if you look at history at all, we haven't done a very good job of it, have we? What we've tended to consider to be good, look at the industrialized world, what it's done to the planet. Think about the terrible pollution we have put, because what was important? Profit, right? So we have polluted the earth. There are places in the world where the water is not fit to drink, because earlier generations thought the only thing to do is to get money out here. We have our laws over the centuries. The wars that we have had are all because somebody determined this was what was right and this was what was wrong, and the result was this tremendous conflict that continues on in the world today. So the upper story, God says, you're not going to take of the tree of life. He cuts them off. The lower story is humans get expelled from the garden. They get what they want, the capacity to choose as they please, and as they please makes what starts out as a big mess a worse mess. And what we have then, as we look in God's story, is this conflict always going on with people between the choice that they will make and what God says is good, or what God says is evil. Think about it today. Go out on any street corner, any place, and ask people, how do you determine what is right and what is wrong? It's a legitimate question. Some people say, well, you know, if you don't hurt anybody, it's okay. Really? Is that what's okay? What about if you don't do anything to somebody who is hurt, and you just don't intervene? Is that okay to do? We saw that not too long ago. You might remember that there was a story about somebody being nearly beat to death after I think it was a football game outside, and for the longest time people just let it happen. They didn't intervene. Well, let's go back to this upper story and lower story. And the upper story, and you're going to read this week in the first chapter there, those first eight chapters of Genesis and chapter 1 of the story, God responds to human shame with compassion, and He makes a sacrifice. What we see is that when Adam and Eve make this choice and they say, we want the capacity to choose right and wrong for ourselves. We want to take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We want to determine what it is, because there probably is the we want thing. We might say that's selfishness, right? You probably could determine it that way. It's what I want. And so when they took it, what did they get? Did they look at each other and they said, oh, this was great fruit, now let's... They looked at each other, and the first thing they determined was that they were naked. But as they determined that they were naked, they also felt shame about their exposure. God responds to that human shame, and this story of redemption, God's reaching out to bring people back to Him. And we see that God covers them with animal skins. And so, while it doesn't go into the details, where did the animals come from? God had to kill part of His creation, these animals, to cover their shame. And so, the idea is born in the Scripture of sacrifice for sin. It's in its infancy, of course, in these passages we're going to read today. But what what's important to understand here is the upper story is the lower story is people say we're naked. The upper story is God covers their shame. The lower story, Genesis 6:3, and you'll see it in your book as well. The lower story is God covers their shame, and of course people begin to multiply because that's what they're supposed to do. And the lower story tells us that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was evil all the time. So here you have people making the choice. We're going to determine what good and evil is, but the result is never good. Even the best intentions of people get twisted. And they get twisted, and the result is not what we intend them to be. And we find that true even in our lives today, in our small part of the lower story. That when we attempt, sometimes even the best things we attempt to do end up having an unintentional negative result. Every inclination of the thought of the human heart was only evil. So here you have God, out of this empty universe, creates people. Well, He creates a universe and creates people in that universe, and He gives us dominion over an entire planet. A crazy thing for anybody to do. We don't even want to give our children dominion over their rooms, and we know that they don't clean them, so they probably don't have dominion over them. But the idea that God gives us this capacity over this entire planet, and what He asks of us is to allow Him to determine what's good and what's evil, and we reject that. And in rejecting it, our hope, our intent is that we're going to make some sort of better world for ourselves. I don't know how Adam and Eve got to that point, but I do know we're all still trying to do the same thing. People who reject God, who reject the idea that they need a relationship with God, always try to fill it with something they assume to be better. They assume that there's something else out there that must be better than walking with God, with having a relationship with Him, whether it's money or relationship or power or prestige. It doesn't matter what it is. We try to shove it in that spot that God created for us, and it never quite fits. And instead what we have is the inclination of our hearts is to go contrary to God. That's what it is. The inclination towards evil is to go against God's rule. That was so out of control, as it is today, that the upper story has a new dimension to it. And that's where this week's story comes to its conclusion. And that is that God chooses a plan, and He chooses a person. The plan is a flood. The flood is going to wipe out evil, and the person is Noah to begin again. And so you have this amazing story of God looking at the earth and seeing all of this evil, and yet He finds a person, as you will see Him do all throughout the rest of the story, with people like Joseph and Moses and Abraham and the prophets and the apostles. God finds a person, and he also institutes a plan. In that plan, Noah's chosen. Noah builds a boat out in the middle of the desert, kind of a crazy thing to do. He wasn't near a big lake. I don't know where he was building this boat. Must have had some sort of a forest near him to build it out of gopher wood. But he builds this huge boat, and the flood happens, and only a few people survive. But what we see as the end of that story happens, and you'll see this as you understand, is that the flood and even Noah didn't solve the problem, did it? The lower story continues next week as we look at God building a nation in His ongoing plan to bring people back to Himself. This week, we come to understand that God created life, and it was very good.